60 Minutes is one of America's most celebrated journalistic institutions. The CBS News magazine has won over 100 Emmy Awards since the program first launched in 1968 and is revered for its investigative reports that have revealed everything from government corruption to military cover-ups. But like the majority of corporate news today, the program has largely succumbed to its paymasters and government sources, most recently airing infomercials for the NSA and Amazon, while also producing widely debunked reports on the Benghazi embassy attack and subsidies for green energy companies. But according to one former 60 Minutes insider, the program has been long besieged by conflicts of interest and internal censorship. Charles Lewis is a former producer for ABC News and 60 Minutes. And in a new piece for Politico taken from his new book, titled Why I Left 60 Minutes, he outlines the reasons why he rejected a successful career in the corporate news media to start his own investigative journalism institution. So to discuss his time at 60 Minutes as well as the future of investigative journalism, I'm joined now by Charles Lewis himself, founder of the Center for Public Integrity and author of the new book, 935 Lies, The Future of Truth and the Decline of America's Moral Integrity. Thank you so much for coming on, Charles. So in your book, you outline your experience at ABC News, 60 Minutes. At ABC, you refused a promotion to work with Geraldo Rivera. How could you? I'm just joking. And in 60 Minutes, you end up resigning due to censorship. Talk about the circumstances that led you to completely resign from the corporate media.
Well, with the ABC case, I didn't want to work with Geraldo Rivera. He had done some kind of crazy things, or not crazy, but a little bit over the top, and I didn't feel comfortable, and it would have doubled or tripled my salary, but I said no, which was, you're not supposed to say no to the executives, I've discovered. So my name was mud there for my rest of my days there. So I got a call one day from Mike Wallace. I joined 60 Minutes as one of his investigative producers, and you know, he was a sensational reporter and interviewer, to be fair to him, but I also noticed there were certain stories that he and the show didn't want to do, which, you know, they technically have a right to do. They're my bosses. But I noticed we were pulling our punches or not doing certain subjects, or certain people's names would be not in a script. And the thing that did it at the end was I had someone who was basically one of the founder of 60 Minutes' best friends was involved in a company that we were reporting on, and they kept not approving the story, and it was perishable. It had to air at a certain time sequence over a period of weeks, and I was near the end of that. So if we didn't air soon, I'd lose the piece. So I had to take his name out of the script, and I resigned the next day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
You know, obviously in every newsroom there's heated debate over, you know, how to cover stories and what stories to cover, what stories not to cover. What specifically was it about the culture of these newsrooms that kind of made you so disgusted? Well,
there were basically, we were not really doing serious investigative reporting. We were doing stories about investigations that others were doing, like the government, but there was no, I wanted to actually do original investigations. I went to do interviews with folks who were directly involved. I want to go through the documents myself. I didn't want to come in after newspapers had written about it and just do a morality play based on a few key peoples in somebody's article. So I had a difference of what I thought we would be doing.
You know what, that's a really good point, because even when I cover topics like on this show, people say, well, I didn't read about that in the New York Times or see it on CNN, so how do I know that that's the truth? And that's exactly going with what you're saying, is that when you do original investigations, people still want to have it confirmed by all these other places.
Well, they do. I would write memos and say, do you know this is about to happen? It was a big, big story. Several times this happened, and they'd say, well, I didn't read it in the New York Times, and I'd say, that's not my job to read the paper and tell you what's in the paper. My job is to find original things. But they would be insecure about it. They didn't really want to venture out. And also, honestly, they didn't want to spend the money to have someone like me look at something for 6 months and a year and be out of commission to do any other subject.
Exactly. Investigative reporting is extremely time-consuming, extremely expensive. You know, over the years, of course, you've spoken out against the corporate media apparatus, but why did you decide to write this story now?
Well, I have been working on this book about what had happened, Information and Truth. It's been bothering me for many, many years. This book took 9 years, 3 manuscripts, 2 publishers. So it was a hard thing to write. I also, you know, I'm friends with Lowell Bergman, and of course when the Insider thing came out with the tobacco industry and internal censorship by CBS in that instance, you know, I could have talked about it then, but I didn't want to be seen as piling on in the middle of the thing, although Lowell would have liked me to have said something. On the other hand, so I waited until I felt it was time to talk about it. So I can't do a book about truth and information if I don't acknowledge that occasionally the media is great. See Watergate, see the Pentagon Papers, see some other things. But occasionally the media itself has not quite done what we'd like it to do or what it ought to do.
Well, you know, it's amazing because 60 Minutes, I grew up as a kid watching 60 Minutes as like the one true investigative news program, and you saw it on you know, every week, and you're really excited to see what they're going to cover. And it just seems like it's denigrated so much to today, where, you know, airing essentially infomercials for the NSA, drones, the Benghazi attacks special. I mean, what do you think are the factors contributing to the once venerable program's decline?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is, you know, the TV audiences are getting much younger for advertisers, but yet 60 Minutes, while it's still in the top 10 shows, which is unbelievable, and roughly 40 years later, more than whatever it is at this point, it's been on a long, long time, the longest running top 10 news show in the history of television. But their viewership is actually older folks over 50. There are some very fine producers. I have very close friends who worked with me who are still there, who do great work when they can do that work. I think some of the shows in the past season have been not good, and some of the ones you've mentioned earlier were not up to their standards. Having a former government official do a story about the NSA and some of the other stories, that's just plain poor judgment. It appeared in some cases to be flackery regarding one or two companies, and that is, you know, that has to do with management as much as it does with line producers and researchers internally. It has to do with who decides what goes on the air and where the checks and balances there. So anyway, here's the weird thing. It's still the best news magazine show probably in the United States to this moment, even though it has slipped, I think it's fair to say, in this past year. But I also know great journalists there who do great work.
Right, sure.
They've had a very, I'd say, a rough year.
Right, it has indeed. Do you think that has anything to do with kind of the corporate pressure of now this corporate media apparatus, where we have about 6 corporations controlling essentially 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read? Could that be adding some pressure to kind of the sensationalism or essentially these puff pieces?
Well, it is. When I was there as an investigative producer for Mike Wallace, I would do 4 stories a year. I know that in the last few years they moved that up to 6 stories a year. That means less time on the story. You find easier stories. That means you're doing book reports, but you're also doing interviews with gets, you know, some newsmaker that'll make news on Monday morning after the show, and you're not doing investigative things that take time and cost money. And so that part of it is that. It is more stories, less time. Part of it is the attention span of the media, and part of it is we live in a real quick world now. Shorter sound bites, everything's shorter and faster, and yet 60 Minutes is still doing 11 to 13-minute segments, and holding a story in the can for 6 months now is almost unimaginable. And that's the old model. So it's very hard for them to do a story that's not real time, like something that happened last week in Iraq or wherever it is. So they're tethered to reality a little.
Well, how do we bridge this kind of old dinosaur media, not to call 60 Minutes dinosaur media, you know what I'm saying, exactly what you're saying, the long-form investigative journalism. How do we marry that with kind of these shorter attention spans of kids now learning about why investigative journalism is crucial and needs to be continued?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm probably not objective in this regard. I've been in the nonprofit space. I started the Center for Public Integrity at my house after I quit 60 Minutes, and it's been around 25 years, just won a Pulitzer Prize, and there are now 100 nonprofit newsrooms with 1,000 to 2,000 journalists who used to be in the commercial realm who've moved to that space. The ProPublica's Center for Investigative Reporting, the first one in the U.S., even before my organization. And I now have a reporting center at American University. There are 18 at universities teaching young people how to do it as students, but also working with the New York Times, the Washington Post, leading outlets, Frontline, and other places. So I see inculcating these values with a new generation, but I also see partnerships. We jointly hired a reporter, a Pulitzer Prize winner, with the Washington Post. We didn't have enough money to hire him ourselves, my investigative reporting workshop. The Post didn't, so we did it together, and we're sharing his salary. A lot of creativity now in finding new ways to do deeper, longer, better stories.
Because the media landscape right now in America is very barren. I mean, you have virtually no funding for organizations like yours. I mean, how do you train people who are working with the Center for Public Integrity to operate without conflicts of interests for future practices?
You disclose, well, for nonprofits, you disclose your donors. It's very, very important you do that. You make sure the money is either general support, just for the act of doing investigative reporting, or it's subject areas that are so broad it's not pegged to a specific story. You make sure that the folks you're working with are not so closely tethered to an agenda that it will impugn your own integrity. Those are the kinds of things you try to do. And you work on a story for 1 or 2 years, and you go through 10 data sets of various sources, and you cross-mesh and you show the public the records as well as the written story, and they can make their own judgment.
And to wrap it up, we have about a minute left, but I wanted to talk about your book really quickly, 935 Lies. You outline various ways in which the government has lied to people for the past 4 decades, why investigative journalism is crucial to uncover the lies. I wanted you to give just some of the most egregious examples that Americans may not know about and why that kind of leads into what you're doing today.
Oh, well, thanks. I think the 3 most obvious ones, 935 Lies comes from all the statements by the George W. Bush administration, the top 8 officials over 2 years, 380,000 word database. We actually tracked every false and erroneous statement that turned out to be
that's a lot.
Flatly true. Yeah, it's not good. We noticed that 40 years ago, the same thing happened with Vietnam. We were actually not attacked by North Vietnam. We were provoking an attack against them, or them getting them to attack us for months. We didn't find out till 1971, years later, with the Pentagon Papers. And of course, the worst lie of all time in the 20th century, worse than the World War II or anything that happened with all the things, is tobacco. 100 million people died from smoking. Tobacco lied about its product to the public for 60 full years. So those are 3, but we have hundreds of lies.
932 more.
Right, quite a number, yeah.
Everyone check it out. Thank you so much.
Thank
Charles
you.
Lewis, founder of the Center for Public Integrity. Amazing work. Thanks so much for your insight.